What's up, everybody? Today I am bringing you a list of 31 horror movie recommendations. I'm doing this as like kind of a special for Halloween for October for the spooky season. And I also wanted to talk some more about horror movies. Horror movies are my second love right behind reading. And I always intended to talk about them more on my channel, and I just never end up doing that for some reason. I don't really do too many horror movie reviews or discussion videos. So this kind of gives me a chance to talk about them a little bit more, some of my favorites. And I'm giving you 31 movies here, one for each day of October. And the movies I'll be talking about aren't all necessarily like among my top favorites or anything, or even related to Halloween or October. Basically, I'm going to be talking about some horror movies that I feel like are a little bit underrated, some kind of hidden gems, some ones that aren't as well known. So I will not be discussing really more popular kind of mainstream horror movies, more well-known ones such as like the Halloween franchise, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even though I love that. We'll not be discussing that today. Movies like The Conjuring, Friday the 13th, a lot of like the really big name horror movies that everyone knows about and most horror fans have seen by now. So yeah, while all those movies are great and classics, they've been discussed to death. If you're a horror fan, you've likely seen all of those or most of them. And there are some fairly well-known movies on this list that I've constructed. Some of these are fairly popular. And if you're a horror fan like I am, you've probably seen or at least know about quite a few of these. These aren't like super hidden or obscure movies, but kind of slightly lesser known than like the ones I already mentioned. So yeah, I'm going to kind of be giving you a list of like some underrated horror movies, at least in my opinion. Some of these are ones that I've seen recently. Some of them are ones that I've been a fan of for a very long time. And I've kind of split this up into categories as well. I have like a handful of different subgenres that I picked, and I'll be putting like timestamps down below somewhere to where you can kind of skip ahead and like look at a certain category if you want to, if there's like certain subgenres or categories that fit your taste more or that you care to see. And I have like a few movies in each one, and we'll be going from category to category. And let's just get started, I suppose. Starting things off with the first category, we have slashers. Every horror fan loves slasher movies. It's definitely one of the most popular subgenres in horror. It's not quite like one of my top personal favorites, but there are quite a few slasher movies that I do enjoy. And I picked 3 slasher movies to put into this category. And the first one is Maniac Cop. This is a movie that I feel like does not get talked about enough. I absolutely love this movie. This is actually a franchise. I decided to just pick the first Maniac Cop for this list. But honestly, I enjoy this entire franchise. And the second one is also really, really good. Just as good as this one, to be honest. Maybe even better in some ways. I think the second one, from what I remember, is a little bit more action-packed and more violent. And yeah, I love this movie. If you're a fan of slashers and you've never seen Maniac Cop, I would highly recommend this one. Another thing, too, is I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on each movie just because we do have 30 movies to go over. And I don't want this video to be like an hour long, which it will probably end up being anyway, because I always say I don't plan for my videos to be long, and they end up being like 45 minutes sometimes. So, okay. The second slasher movie, movie number 2 on my list, is Wrong Turn. And this is probably a little bit more of a well-known one. Of course, this is a massive franchise, as kind of like a cult following. However, even though it's kind of blown up into a franchise, I still feel like this first movie is underappreciated. This movie is really good and actually pretty creepy. This is one of the few modern-day horror movies that actually creeps me out a bit. The Cannibal Hillbillies in this are just terrifying. It's a very suspenseful movie. The acting is pretty good for the most part. It is very simple and basic, and it's nothing new or original. It's basically a modern retelling of like the backwoods horror movies from the 70s, like Hills Have Eyes, Texas Chainsaw, that sort of thing. But I still feel like this movie just doesn't get enough credit. It is super, super solid and one of my all-time favorites. I do like some of the other sequels in this franchise as well, but I think the very first Wrong Turn movie is the best one. So yeah, this is movie number 2 on my list and the second slasher. And then for my third and final slasher movie, we have Hell Night. It's been a little while since I've seen this movie, but I remember really enjoying this. This is definitely, I think, one of the better slashers that I've seen. And it's basically about like this, I think, sorority house, and they have this kind of initiation rite to where they have to put these new members into like this haunted mansion, and they have to stay the night. And the like sorority house kids or whatever basically set up all of these like fake ghosts and pranks and different things to try to scare these kids. But it turns out that this haunted mansion that they're staying in might actually be haunted after all. But it's not haunted in the way that you would expect. It's not like a classic like supernatural or haunted house story. There are some physical evil villains in the story, and there is a killer. And the reveal is pretty cool, and yeah, I like this movie. If you have not seen Hell Night and you're a fan of slashers, I would recommend checking this one out. Okay, moving on to the next category, we have modern movies. And how I decided to define modern movies, at least for this particular list and video, is pretty much any horror movie that has come out within the last like 20 years. Obviously, everyone's definition is going to be a little bit different. I just kind of settled on that for this particular video. And I know this technically isn't like a subgenre. That's why I'm kind of calling it category. So yeah. Okay. Coming in at number 4 on my list of horror movie recommendations, and the first modern movie we're talking about, is House of the Devil. And some of these movies I'll be talking about, I don't own copies of yet. So I'll just pop a picture of the poster somewhere up here on the screen. And this is one that I saw somewhat recently. And this is a movie directed by Ty West. One of his earlier films. This is the guy that brought us the X trilogy, which is fairly new. I think the first X movie came out in 2022. And it was a pretty good movie. And this House of the Devil, excuse me, this was a pretty good movie as well. I really enjoyed this. It has a really good setup. One of my favorite things about it is actually just the setup and like slice of life feel to it that we get, and the characters. Ty West, there's just something about like the characters and dialogue that he writes and the atmosphere to it. This movie has really creepy atmosphere. It all just provides kind of like this immersive experience that you don't find too often in horror movies, or at least I don't. And I think Ty West just really has some talent when it comes to filmmaking in general. This movie's not perfect. I don't, full on love it. A lot of these movies on this list are not like all-time favorites for me or 5 out of 5 stars or anything. But I do think it's a pretty good film. The final act, there were some things I was a little bit disappointed with, but overall I thought this was a pretty good horror movie. I would recommend checking out The House of the Devil. All right, coming in at number 5, and my second modern, is The Color Out of Space, starring Nicolas Cage. And this came out in 2019, I believe. Yeah, I think 2019. And this is an adaptation of the short story by H.P. Lovecraft, of course. And while not quite as good as H.P. Lovecraft's masterpiece, this is a pretty good adaptation of it. It's a very modern retelling of Lovecraft's story, so it's quite a bit different. It takes a lot of creative liberty. It doesn't stay like super faithful to the story, but I think it's for the better. I think we get kind of a unique take on this story, and I think it stays true to Lovecraft's short story in the sense that it's just very weird, very bizarre, and it has that Lovecraftian vibe to it, even though it's not like identical to the short story. And I just enjoy it for that reason. I don't know how else to describe this movie. It's just a very weird sci-fi horror movie, and it has a lot of like just gross and gnarly imagery, and it's kind of artsy too, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's just very artistic in a way. I don't know. I like this movie. The Color Out of Space is pretty good. I would recommend checking this one out. All right, coming in at number 6 in my next modern is The Loved Ones. Aliens. This movie came out in 2012, and this is an Australian horror movie. And this movie is fantastic. This one is definitely a hidden gem and a very underrated movie in my opinion. It's kind of like dealing with like psychos, serial killers a little bit. It draws a little bit of inspiration from like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it's different enough to where it's not like ripping off that movie. Yeah, The Loved Ones. This is a pretty good movie. It's very violent. There's some torture and stuff in here. So if you're not into that kind of thing, maybe this isn't for you. But I loved it. This movie was awesome. And it also has some nice like comedy to it as well. There's some good humor in this movie. So it has a little bit of like a lighthearted, like comedy edge to it that kind of like offsets that like darker, more like violent nature of it, if that makes sense. So yeah, this was a pretty good movie. I would recommend checking this one out. Okay, my next modern movie coming in at number 7 is Barbarian. This came out in 2022, I believe. I went to the theaters to see this by myself, and I went into this movie completely blind. I didn't know much about it. I don't even remember what led me to want to go see this. I think it was just kind of an impulse thing. I just am like, you know what? I'm going to go check out this new horror movie, Barbarian. It ended up being a massive surprise. I loved this movie. And part of the reason is because this movie has so many crazy twists and turns in it that are so unpredictable. Even as a seasoned horror movie fan myself that has seen probably hundreds of horror movies at this point, I did not see any of the twists coming in this movie. And if anyone does predict them, they're lying. This movie is just so much fun. It is a wild ride. I'm not sure how much it will hold up upon rewatch. I've only seen it the once. I would like to rewatch it at some point if a physical copy ever comes out for it. Don't know if it will. But yeah, at some point I'd like to rewatch this. But I would highly recommend checking out Barbarian. This movie is crazy. So yeah. Alright, and then my last modern, coming in at number 8 on my list, this is Pearl. Another Ty West movie. And this is the middle entry in the X trilogy. And you don't have to watch all 3 of these movies, and you don't necessarily have to watch them in order. They can be viewed as like standalone films. And I picked Pearl because this is my personal favorite one. And I think part of that is because it's very psychological. It deals more with psychological horror, which is something I really like and something that kind of scares me a little bit more than just violence and visceral kills and blood and gore and that kind of thing. And the acting in this movie by Mia Goth, playing the main character of Pearl, is just absolutely phenomenal. She does a great job throughout this entire franchise, but her acting in this movie is like top notch. It is the best out of the 3 by far. It's basically about Pearl's like slow descent into madness. She starts out as kind of like this normal girl. This movie takes place a long time ago, back in the 20s, and she lives on this farm, and she's kind of poor. And she wants to like make it big in life and become like a Hollywood star. And she begins this slow descent into madness and just turns crazy and psycho. And it is epic. Yeah, I absolutely love Pearl. This is a great movie. This is the last movie on my modern list. So yeah, go check that out if you haven't seen it yet. Okay, the next category we'll be talking about is classics. Now, I watch a lot of classics. I watch a lot of old black and white movies. I honestly could probably make like an entire video on this category, but for the sake of this video, I narrowed it down to 4 movies. And the first one we'll be talking about, coming in at number 9 on my list, is The Leopard Man. This movie is directed by Jack Turner, and the same guy that directed the movie Cat People, which you may have heard of, which is a very famous and rightfully popular psychological horror film, one of my favorites of all time. And The Leopard Man is also a very good, like, kind of mystery horror movie. It has like a little bit of psychological aspect to it. Not nearly as good as Cat People, but this is another good movie that just bleeds atmosphere. Just the directing and the camera work and the use of like shadows and lighting, it is just so eerie. I don't even know how to articulate it. This movie is just so creepy. I love the atmosphere in some of these old horror movies. The black and white movies kind of have that benefit of not having lighting, of just having like that kind of just eerie atmosphere to them. And yeah, The Leopard Man, I would recommend checking this movie out. This is a pretty good movie. Okay, the next movie in my classics category, coming in at number 10, is The Bad Seed. This is like the original evil child story, before The Omen, before Orphan, before however many other like evil kid stories there are. I'm sure there's quite a few I can't think of. We got The Bad Seed. And this is based on a novel by William March, and I have read the book as well, which was also really good. And the movie is really solid as well. I honestly think I like both about equally. They're kind of good for different reasons. They're a little bit different. There's some things that I like about the movie that the book doesn't quite have, and then there's some things I like about the book a little bit better that the movie doesn't quite have. Overall, I think this is a really solid and underrated horror movie that I don't really see anyone talk about. The acting in it is really good. It is a little bit of kind of a drama. It's a bit slow, and it's just a lot of like character study, and just there's some melodrama in here. It's not like super, there's not like a high kill count in this or anything. It's pretty much just the parents, or specifically the mother, trying to figure out what to do about her daughter when she learns that she's like this sociopath, essentially. And it's kind of like disturbing a little bit. Even though it's very old and kind of tame by today's like standards, it's still very just kind of an off-putting movie, but it's pretty good. I would recommend checking out The Bad Seed. Okay, my next movie on my classics category is 13 Ghosts. I actually watched this somewhat recently. I think maybe like last year it was. I think I watched this. And there's a newer 13 Ghosts movie that came out, I don't remember now, like late 90s, early 2000s sometime. And a lot of people know about that one, but I don't think many people know about this original 13 Ghosts movie. This is the other 13 Ghosts movie. That's like a really crappy remake. I'm not a big fan of that movie. I mean, it's not horrible, I guess, but yeah. I'm talking about the original 13 Ghosts. I think this movie is from like the 60s. And this is a fun movie. And it actually has some creepy scenes in it. And it's also got like some charm to it as well, like a little bit of humor. And with it being kind of an older movie as well, it's kind of on the like tamer side. It doesn't have, a lot of like the gruesome stuff in it that you would find in the remake. But I think this original is much better. I really enjoyed 13 Ghosts. If you have not seen this movie, I would recommend checking this out. Okay, and then the last movie in my classics list, coming in at number 12 on my list overall, is Spider Baby. Now, I have talked about this movie before on my channel in a video I did where I talked about like my top 10 favorite horror movies of all time. And yes, I love this movie that much. I think this movie will forever remain in like my top 5 horror movies of all time. This movie has kind of gained a cult following by now, and it has gained a little bit more of like a reputation, and some more attention has been brought to it over the years. But it's still not a very talked about movie. It still remains, I think, kind of an obscure film. But I absolutely adore this movie. I think it is absolutely fantastic. I have nothing negative to say about this movie. I don't think it will necessarily be for everyone. It's a very kind of like niche movie, if that makes sense. I think it's for a more niche audience. But if it's one of those movies where if you like it, you're going to absolutely love it. And for the people that don't understand it, or it's not their cup of tea, they're probably going to hate it. I don't really think there's going to be much in between on this movie, if that makes sense. So yeah, but for me, this is an all-time favorite. This is a classic. I absolutely adore Spider Baby. I could rant on and on and on about this movie, but for the sake of the video, we'll move on. So yeah, that's the last movie coming in at my classics category and number 12 on my list. Okay, the next category we are going to be talking about is anthology horror movies. Now, this is one of my favorite subgenres of horror, which is why I decided to include it on this list. And I have 4 movies in this category. And the first one we're going to be talking about is Dead of Night. This came out in the 40s. I want to say 1945. but don't quote me on that. I know it's like in the mid-40s, I believe. And Dead of Night, I think, was one of the very first, possibly the first horror anthology movie. I know it was the one that at least kind of like introduced this sort of subgenre, and then more horror anthologies started coming out after this. And to this day, I think Dead of Night is one of the best horror anthology movies. And there is a later horror anthology movie also called Dead of Night that I think came out in the 70s. So don't confuse that movie with this one. I think they're completely different. I don't believe that it's a remake. At least, I don't think so. I haven't seen it, but from what I've heard and seen about it online, I think it's like a completely separate movie. But anyway, this first Dead of Night movie is awesome. If you're into like older, like classics, black and white movies, I would definitely recommend checking this out. It has kind of like a Twilight Zone feel to it. I believe there's 5 different segments in this movie. Some of them are a little bit better than others, obviously, but overall, this was a great movie. This is definitely one I want to add to my collection one day. So yeah, Dead of Night, super underrated anthology movie. And then the next anthology movie coming in at number 14 on my list is Dead Time Stories. I believe this is also a very underrated horror anthology. This one came out in the 80s, and it just, I don't know. This is another one that seems to be a little bit obscure or just not generally well liked. And this one is kind of like a dark fairy tale movie. These are basically retellings of like fairy tales for kids, except for adults, and they're more violent and bloody. And I just really like this movie. I'm a kind of person that likes like fairy tale type stuff, whether it be traditional fairy tales for like kids, like the really old ones, or retellings. I'm just into that sort of thing. Fairy tales, folklore, legends. I like that kind of stuff. So this movie appeals to me. And Dead Time Stories, this movie is awesome. I don't understand why this horror anthology doesn't get talked about more. It has a total of 3 segments. I do think that the first segment is probably my favorite. But the second and third ones are also very good. The third segment in this movie is absolutely batshit insane. And it's more leaning into the comedic territory for how absurd that it is. It's like a retelling of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, if I remember correctly. But I think it also has like some elements of other fairy tales thrown in there. But it is just so ridiculous and absurd. You just have to see it to understand. But yeah, this is a pretty good horror anthology movie as well. I would recommend checking out Dead Time Stories. Okay, the next one in the anthology category and coming in at number 15 on my list is A Christmas Horror Story. I thought about doing a category for like holiday horror movies or like Christmas horror movies, but I couldn't really think about too many. I thought of like a couple of others, so I just decided to kind of lump this one into anthology movies. And this movie is awesome. I love this movie. This one has, I think, 4 segments, if I remember correctly. It's been a little while since I've seen it. I need to rewatch it. 4 segments, and most of them are pretty good. I think there's one that I didn't care for quite as much. And this one also has a crazy twist ending as part of like the wraparound segment in this movie. Like just an absolutely crazy twist ending that I promise you will not see coming. And it is awesome. So yeah, Christmas Horror Story. This is a pretty good movie. Good to watch during October or December, whatever you prefer. And yeah, I'd recommend checking this one out. Alright, and then the final movie, my anthology category, and coming in at number 16 on my list, is Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. This is actually my favorite anthology horror movie of all time. And there's a lot of them I like, so that's quite saying something. There's a total of 3 segments in this movie, and I think all of them are really good. The first one isn't quite perfect. The first segment in this movie is like a 4 out of 5 stars. It's based on a short story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes. And it's pretty good, but not quite, amazing. And then the second 2 segments, the second and the third, are 5 out of 5 for me. Absolutely fantastic. One of them is The Cat from Hell, which is based on a short story by Stephen King. And then the third one was written exclusively for this movie, and it is called Lover's Vow, and it is written by Michael McDowell. But it is based on an old Japanese folk tale. So it's not like completely original, but It is my favorite version of that, like, old traditional, like, ghost story. So yeah, and the wraparound story in this is pretty good as well. Of course, a lot of you probably know Tales from the Dark Side TV show, but I think this movie is the best of, like, this franchise, in my opinion. I prefer this movie over, like, the entire show. So yeah, I love this movie, Tales from the Dark Side. If you're a fan of anthology horror and you haven't seen this yet, you need to give this a watch. So yeah. Okay, that concludes my anthology horror category. And now we are moving on to foreign horror movies. I have 4 movies in this category as well. And unfortunately, I do not own copies of any of these. I would like to get copies of them eventually, but for now, I don't have any copies of them. Okay, so coming in at number 17 on my list, the first foreign horror movie I'm going to be talking about is called Kuroneko, if I'm pronouncing this right. And this is another, like, older classic movie. I think this came out in the 60s, I believe, and it's in black and white. And I believe it translates to The Black Cat, and this movie is based on an old Japanese legend / ghost story that has been around for a long time. And this movie is creepy as hell. I have seen quite a few Japanese, like, classic horror movies. I've seen, what's the name of it? There's one I literally just watched. Onibaba, I think it's called. I just watched that one, and it was kind of okay. I didn't really see what all the hype was about. I've seen Kwaidan, I think it's called. I've seen a lot of, like, classic Japanese horror movies in general, and this is by far the scariest one, in my opinion. This is one of those horror movies that really makes good use of the black and white, with, like, the shadows and the lack of lighting, and it just has this oozing just atmosphere to it. It is just so eerie, and it has just this very startling imagery in the scenes where this ghost comes into play in the movie, and the way that this ghost moves around and appears, it is frightening. Honestly, this movie is like one of the first horror movies to introduce, like, real jump scares, in my opinion. Yeah, I remember the first time I watched this movie and the first time the ghost appears. It makes quite a dramatic appearance. It's not, like, super subtle. It makes quite the dramatic appearance. And I remember when I was watching this for the first time, I was just like, what the hell? It, like, actually freaked me out. So yeah, Kuroneko, I highly recommend checking this one out. Okay, the next foreign movie, coming in number 18 on my list, is also a Japanese movie. And this one is Pulse. And this is one that I just watched recently. And I will say that as a whole, this movie isn't one that I loved or I would, like, give a huge recommendation for. I don't know if it was just the story or what it was overall. The movie as a whole didn't really appeal to me. I didn't feel satisfied with it at the end. However, I don't know what it is about these Japanese movies that freak me out, but man, this movie has some creepy ass scenes in it. One scene in particular is one of the scariest scenes in any horror movie I have ever seen in my life. I don't scare easily. I've seen, again, hundreds of horror movies in my time, and more oftentimes than not, I'm just watching them for entertainment value. It's tough to scare me. There's, like, a small handful of horror movies that have actually either, like, made me jump or felt very unsettled, and this is one of those movies to do that. The particular scene I'm referring to, for those of you who have seen this, is the hallway scene with the ghost, where the ghost is walking down the hallway. You guys probably know what I'm talking about if you've seen this. That scene was absolutely terrifying. One of the scariest scenes I've ever seen in a horror movie. So yeah, if you haven't seen Pulse, I would recommend checking that out. Just for that scene alone, honestly. Okay, the next foreign horror movie I'm going to be talking about, coming in at number 19 on my list, is Suspiria. And this is one of the more well-known, probably popular movies on this list. Like I said, not every single movie on this list is going to be super obscure. And this is an Italian horror film that came out in the 70s, I believe. And this movie is not, like, a huge favorite of mine or one I really love, but it's a very stylistic movie. It has just a lot of really cool shots and, like, just style to it. And it has a really cool soundtrack, and just, this movie is just a vibe. I don't know how else to explain it. There's not much of a story to it. It's basically about this girl that goes to, like, this dance school, and weird things start to happen. and it feels all very random, but this movie just has so much flair and color and just vibrancy to it that it just gives the movie a character in of itself, I guess, if that makes sense. So yeah, Suspiria is one that I would recommend checking out. Again, it's not like a huge favorite of mine just because it is kind of lacking in the story department. But it is still a very cool movie, and it has some pretty creepy stuff in it as well. So yeah, Suspiria. I would recommend checking that one out. Okay, and then the last movie in my foreign category, and this is the one that I feel like is probably the most obscure. I feel like I'll be surprised, honestly, if any of you have seen this one. And if you have, please let me know. I have to know. And that is Little Otik. This is a Czechoslovakian horror film that is based on an old like folk tale, legend, whatever, from their country that's been around for a long time. And this is a movie that was actually recommended to me by one of my coworkers. They told me about this movie. I had never even heard of it. I knew nothing about it. And I watched this. And after I watched it, my reaction was, what the hell did I just watch? What was that movie? And then followed by, that was amazing. How have I never heard of or seen this movie? Now, I'm going to kind of liken this movie to Spider Baby. I think this is going to be for a more niche audience. I don't think this will be for everyone. I don't think there will be much in between on this movie. I actually got another one of my coworkers to watch this movie, and he absolutely hated it, thought it was horrible. So I think it's going to be a very love it or hate it type film. I loved it. I'm one of the few that sees the genius of this movie. It's a very strange movie. It has a lot of like stop motion imagery to it. The very plot of it is very bizarre. Again, it's kind of based on this old folk tale. And it's basically about this woman who loses her child, her baby dies, and in her grief, she kind of goes a little bit crazy, and she goes out and like carves a baby out of like a tree stump or a log that I think her husband cuts, and she pretends that it's her baby and acts like it's a real child and like feeds it and nurses it and everything. And pretty soon, this little tree stump log thing comes to life and becomes this creature. And it's so bizarre and just a WTF type of movie, but it is epic. This movie is like one of my highest recommendations on this list. If you have not seen Little Otik, you need to go watch this. So yeah. Okay. Moving on to the next category, we have killer animals / animal attack movies. I love killer animal movies. I'm a sucker for animal stories in general. I'm kind of like a nature animal person, even when they're in horror movies and portrayed in a very unrealistic or kind of negative manner as like, the villains or the killers. I still enjoy that kind of thing as well. And I have 3 horror movies that I chose for this killer animal category. And the first one is a really new movie. It just came out this year. I was going to say like fairly new, but it just came out this year, so it's basically brand new. And that is Sting. This movie is basically about a giant killer spider. And what more can you want? What more can you say about that? This is such a fun movie. It's very solid. I really enjoyed this. Yeah, Sting, a giant killer spider. If you want to see it wreaking havoc in this small apartment building and killing people, if that sounds like it's something that you would like, then I would check this out. This was a pretty good movie. So yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite horror movies of 2024. Okay. My next killer animal movie, coming in at number 22 on my list, is a little bit of an older one, and one that I watched somewhat recently for my first time, and that is Razorback. This is a movie that came out in the 80s. This is an Australian horror movie, and it's about a killer wild boar that's like massive, like much bigger than your average wild hog. This thing is like almost the size of a hippo, like maybe not quite that big, but close. And this movie was so much fun. It's kind of like a campy, cheesy type of fun horror movie. It's not meant to be taken like 100% seriously. It's not, super scary or anything, but this was just such an entertaining movie. And this is also one of those horror movies that's very kind of like stylistic. And it has a lot of practical effects. And the wild boar, the killer wild boar in this movie, they use like a real, I'm not sure if it's like an animatronic or like a puppet, but it's like a real prop that they use. It's not, super fake looking. It actually looks pretty good. And they have these weird effects that they use, like camera effects, like, excuse me, like when the wild boar will come on for like a kill scene, they'll like shake, the camera will like get all shaky to like make it seem more intense. And the wild boar will just be like screaming, and it'll be these crazy sound effects. And it is just so cool. I loved it. This is one of those movies that, it kind of reminds me of Suspiria in certain ways, to where it's just a vibe. That sounds like something that you can vibe with, I would recommend checking out Razorback. This was such a fun movie. Yeah, Razorback from the 80s, Australian horror movie. This was pretty good. Okay, then the last killer animal movie I'll be talking about, coming in at number 23 on my list, is Deep Blue Sea. This is a little bit of an older movie as well. I think this came out in the 90s, I want to say. Yeah, 1999. But I did not see it until somewhat recently. And this is a really fun movie. This is kind of like Jurassic Park, but with sharks instead of dinosaurs. It's got some like comedy to it a little bit. This is another one of just those campy, fun type of horror movies. It's not really meant to be scary. You're not supposed to take it, super seriously. It's just a fun horror movie. I don't know how else to describe it other than it's Jurassic Park, but with sharks. They're holding all of these sharks like captive in this research facility out in the middle of the ocean. The research facility like starts to break down. It floods. There's this huge storm. I don't know if it's like a tsunami or something. I don't know. And all these sharks start kind of swimming throughout this facility and just eating the heck out of people. And it's highly entertaining. So yeah, Deep Blue Sea. This is like one of the best killer shark movies I've seen. And this concludes my killer animal category. So yeah, I would check this one out. Okay, let me organize my movies real quick here. Okay, next category is comedy horror. Now, comedy horror is another subgenre that I really, really enjoy. I think humor and horror go really well together. And I could probably make like an entire video, an entire list of just horror comedies that I absolutely love and would like to recommend. But for the sake of this video, I just decided to pick 4 of them. And the first one is also kind of a killer animal movie, so it's kind of like blending the last category I talked about with this one, and that is Eight-Legged Freaks. This is a movie that I actually saw parts of years and years ago on like the Sci-Fi Channel when I was younger, and I just don't think I ever saw the whole thing. And at the time, I probably, I don't know, thought it was dumb or just wasn't really into it. I don't know. I don't think I ever watched like the full movie. But rewatching this somewhat recently, I absolutely loved this movie. This is another killer spider movie, but unlike Sting, which was a little bit more serious, this one is borderline like full-on comedy. This movie is just awesome, and it's very clever too. One of the things I really like about it is it's not just these generic looking spiders that just look like your basic tarantula. It's very clever and incorporates lots of different species of like real life spiders. And even though it's CGI, it honestly looks pretty good. It's not bad CGI. And they use all of these different species of spiders in very clever ways in this movie. Like there's the jumping spiders, they look real and they jump around. They also have tarantulas, and they also have trapdoor spiders. There's a scene in this movie that I thought was awesome and hilarious, to where you have these people like running, trying to escape from these spiders, and they're running, and these trapdoors just pop open in the ground, and these spiders come up and just pull these people down. Now, obviously, in real life, the trapdoor spider, they don't have actual like trapdoors, but they're named that because they build their webs kind of in the ground and like ambush their prey as it comes by. But I thought that was very clever and very funny. So yeah, this movie is just so much fun. One of my favorite horror comedies, and it also doubles as like an animal attack movie. So yeah, Eight-Legged Freaks. If you haven't seen this, I would recommend giving this one a watch. Okay, coming in at number 25 on my list in my second horror comedy is Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. And this one is a little bit more of like a family-friendly horror comedy. It's rated PG-13. It does have some innuendo and stuff in it. It's not for like super young kids or anything, obviously, but it's more of a like movie that the family could watch if you wanted to. And this is just a really fun movie. Obviously, Elvira is most well known for being like a host of horror movies. She had her own show and series where she would introduce horror movies and kind of like narrate them, and then there would be like cuts in the middle of the movie, and she would talk about that a little bit and make jokes and things like that. And then she eventually got her own movie, Mistress of the Dark, and then of course there is a sequel as well, which I have not seen the whole thing. I started watching it and it wasn't as good, and I never finished it. But yeah, this first Elvira movie, I love this movie. This is hilarious, and it's more of a full-on comedy. It's almost not even really horror, but there is some supernatural elements to it. Towards the end of this movie, in like the third act, there is actually a little bit of horror. There's some like kind of witchcraft stuff going on. So I feel like it is fair game to kind of put this in the horror genre, even though I would say it's mostly comedy. But yeah, I love Elvira. This is a great movie. Okay, coming in at number 26 on my list in my third horror comedy is a more obscure one that I think probably not a lot of people have heard of. And this is a very old movie. This actually might be the oldest movie on this list, and that is Lucky Ghost. Now, this is a movie that stars Manton Moreland. For those of you who don't know, he was a comedian back in the day and a movie actor. He did a lot of stand-up comedy, and he starred in a bunch of old movies back in like the 40s and the 50s. And he was a pretty well-known guy back in the day. I have a couple other movies that he stars in as well. And I really enjoy this movie. This is very old-fashioned comedy, kind of like Abbott and Costello type of stuff. If you're not a fan of that kind of thing, like Abbott and Costello, Three Stooges, it's a little bit more clever. It's not just constant slapstick like Three Stooges, but I was just trying to find things to compare it to. If you're not a fan of like that old school style of comedy, this might not be for you. But I love this movie. I think it's hilarious, and it's a super underrated gem in horror comedies, in my opinion. In Manton Moreland, there was a lot of other old school horror comedies he also starred in. I could make an entire list of horror comedies and have a few movies with him in it. I like that guy, and yeah, Lucky Ghost. This is a pretty good movie, and I can't remember the exact date. Oh, it's right here on the back. It says 1942. So yeah, this is a pretty old movie. Okay, and then concluding my comedy horror category, we have Dead Alive. I absolutely love this movie. This is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. This is like in my top 10. And this is a kind of horror movie that I think can fit into different subgenres. Not only is it a horror comedy, it's kind of like a zombie movie. It has like a little bit of a romance thing to it. It has like a rom-com feel going on. It blends like a lot of different kind of subgenres together. And it's also extremely gory and bloody. I think this movie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this movie still holds the world record for using the most fake blood than any other horror movie. I can't remember what the numbers are, if it's like over 100 gallons of fake blood or something like that. But yeah, this movie is like a splatterpunk movie as well. And yeah, it's absolutely bonkers, absolutely absurd. And it's a little bit of like a riff on Evil Dead. It's definitely kind of stealing, maybe parodying those movies a little bit. But I think it's for all the better. This movie is fantastic. And it was directed by Peter Jackson, the guy that brought us the Lord of the Rings movies, of all things. So yes, Dead Alive. If you have not seen this movie, this is one that I always recommend to people who are horror fans. This is like definitely one of my highest recommendations on this entire list. Absolutely perfect. I love this movie. That's Dead Alive. Okay. Now moving on to the second to the last category, and that is extreme horror. Now, I only have 2 movies in this category. This is a category or a subgenre, I guess I should say, that I dwell in a lot. I can only handle them once in a while. I've only seen a handful of extreme horror movies. But I kind of wanted to include it on this list just for some of you maybe who also watch these. And one of them I think is a genuinely very, very good film, objectively speaking. The first one I'm going to be talking about, and coming in number 28 on my list, is Audition. This is a Japanese horror movie. I don't know what it is about Japanese horror movies. These guys know how to make horror films. And it's based on a novel, I believe. I have not read the book, but I have seen the movie. And it starts out very kind of unassuming. And the whole first half of the movie is basically a romantic comedy. It's about this guy who his wife passes away, and years later, he kind of wants to get back into dating, and he has a son that kind of encourages him to go out again and try to find love again, even though he lost his wife. And so he starts dating, he meets this girl, and it turns out that there may be something wrong with this girl. Not really a big spoiler, because I feel like it's made pretty clear early on. There's some hints dropped throughout the movie that there's something weird about this girl. And then in the second act of this movie, we learn what's wrong with this girl, and that's when we start getting into the more extreme territory and the reasons why this is categorized as an extreme horror movie. This movie does get very violent and graphic towards the back half, and I don't think it's for everybody. However, I will say that it is on the tamer side of extreme horror. Out of all of the extreme horror movies that I've seen, this is one of the tamer ones, so I think it's like a good gateway extreme horror movie, if you know what I mean. So maybe this would be like a good place to start if you want to watch something, a little bit more grisly, but not anything like too disturbing that's going to leave you sleepless. So yeah, Audition. This is a pretty good movie. I would recommend checking this out. Okay, and then the other extreme horror movie coming in at number 29 on my list of recommendations is I Saw the Devil. This is a Korean movie, and I am cheating a little bit. I don't know if this is like officially categorized as a horror movie. I think it's more of a thriller, like suspense thriller. However, the events that take place in this movie and like the content is so horrific that it's basically a horror movie. I mean, there's nothing supernatural going on in here. It's pretty much just all dealing with human characters, human evil, some psychological stuff, that sort of thing. But some of it is just so horrifying and disgusting and depraved that it's basically a horror movie. And the reason I put it on this list is because, as disturbing as this movie is, I think it is, in hindsight, kind of looking back, I think it is one of the best movies I've ever seen in my life, period, of any genre. It is just such a well-made film, so excellently acted, and it's basically a revenge movie. There's this serial killer character that kills this guy's wife, but this guy just so happens to be like a detective, and the police force is like trying to track down the serial killer, and they just can't figure out who he is. They can't find him, and this detective decides to take matters into his own hands and play vigilante and find this guy, and it just turns into a crazy revenge movie with lots of twists along the way. And yeah, this movie is absolutely batshit insane, and I loved it. And I will warn you, it is a very difficult watch. I do not recommend this movie for everyone. There's some SA in here, so trigger warning for that. There is also some very, very graphic and brutal violence in this. Very, very explicit. This is like a whole nother step up from Audition. So be forewarned going into this. This is not a movie for kids. But if you can stomach that sort of thing, I would highly recommend checking this out. I don't know if it's a movie I could ever watch again, just due to the nature and the content of it. But I'm glad that I watched it because it is one of the best movies I've ever seen. So yeah, I wanted to mention that. And this is also one of the ones that comes as like a high recommendation for me. So that's I Saw the Devil. Okay. Moving on to the final category for this list, or for this video, we have Halloween horror. What more fitting for October and for Halloween than a couple of Halloween movies? So I only have 2 movies left on this list, so only 2 movies in this category to talk about. And the first one is kind of a cheat. Some people might not consider it a Halloween movie. There is Halloween in this movie and a Halloween party, but it's kind of like a smaller part of the movie. But it's my list. I can do what I want, and I decided to put it on here. And that is Casper. I believe this movie came out in 1995. And I also thought you know, why not talk about a little bit more of like a family-friendly movie after those nasty extreme horror movies? Let's cleanse our minds a little bit, talk about something a little bit more innocent. And yeah, Casper is a fantastic movie. I absolutely love this film. I remember watching it as a kid, but I don't think it was one I ever loved as a kid. Like, I think I'd only seen it maybe a couple of times. And within the last, I don't know, like couple years or so, or a few years, I rebought this and rewatched it, and I fell in love with this movie. I think I like it more as an adult now than I did back then, even. And yeah, this is just such a fun movie. It's hilarious. It's got spirit to it, pun intended. And this movie does have a couple sequels that I don't think are as good. I haven't seen them in a long time. But yeah, Casper, this is a fantastic movie. Fun for the whole family. And a great Halloween themed movie to check out for the holiday. So yeah, that's Casper coming in at number 30. And the last movie we are talking about, my 31st recommendation, the movie for Halloween, is Trick or Treat. This is an anthology horror film that came out in sometime in the early 2000s, I think. I want to say like 2007. Yeah, 2007. And this is just such a great Halloween horror movie. I was trying to think of some other Halloween themed horror movies. Weirdly enough, I couldn't really think of all that many that I've seen, or ones that were any good at least. And this one is a little bit more of a well-known movie. I know I said I was going to focus more on like underrated horror movies or like lesser known ones, but Casper is obviously very well known, as is this one, and I believe it is very popular as well. But it's just so fitting and perfect for the holiday. Such a fun movie. I do believe that this is one of the best horror anthology films of all time as well. And yeah, this is just like perfect for the holiday. This movie is just, it screams Halloween. It has the atmosphere, the vibes to it, and it has, I can't remember, I think like 3 or 4 different segments into it, but they all kind of like connect and sort of weave together and then kind of like wrap around, the wraparound segment or whatever, they're like all kind of connecting. It's just really cool and a really unique like anthology horror movie, and I really like it. It's not like an all-time favorite for me. It's not quite perfect. I don't love it quite as much as some people, but I do think it's really solid, and I think it's worth checking out. I would recommend it. And it's just so fitting for the holiday that, yeah, I had to include it on this list at spot number 31. So yeah, that's Trick or Treat. Check this out if you haven't yet. And that is it, guys. That is my list of 31 horror movies that I recommended for the holiday season. Feel free to share your thoughts down below in the comments. If you've seen any of these movies, feel free to let me know. And that's all I have today, guys. And I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Peace.